This is what most fans remember when they hear the name Max Biaggi. 6 seconds of contact at nearly 300 kilometers per hour. A middle finger on a podium. A cold silence in a press room. 4 world championships. 13 premier class victories. 42 podiums. And yet, when you close your eyes and try to picture Max Biaggi, you do not see any of that. You see him standing in the corner of another man's photograph. You see him next to Rossi. Always next to Rossi. Biaggi himself once said it plainly. We literally hated each other. But hate is a story. And in this sport, someone else chose which side of that story to keep telling. Every great rivalry in sport gives us 2 legends. Ali had Frazier. Senna had Prost. Lauda had Hunt. You know both names. You can tell both stories. You can argue for hours about which man was greater. Now try it with motorcycle racing. Rossi had... Go ahead, say the name out loud. Most fans can. But watch what happens next. Ask them to tell you about Frazier, and they will. Ask them about Prost, and they can. But ask them about the man who pushed Valentino Rossi harder than anyone else in his first 3 seasons at the top, and the room goes quiet. They remember Suzuka. They remember the finger. They remember the press conferences. But the man himself, the rider, the 4-time world champion who was already winning titles while Rossi was still racing in junior categories, he fades. Like a name written in pencil next to a name written in ink. Biaggi himself put it best. They remember the rivalry. They forgot the racer. So here is the real question of this video. Did MotoGP erase Max Biaggi? Or did it simply stop telling his side of the story? To answer that, we have to go back to a time before Rossi even existed at the top level. Back to when the sport was not asking who could beat Valentino, it was asking who could beat Max. To understand what MotoGP erased, you first have to understand what MotoGP had. The year is 1990. A young Italian from Rome walks into the 250cc paddock with almost no reputation and almost no money. His name is Massimiliano Biaggi. Nobody expects much from him. 4 years later, everything changes. 1994, world champion. 1995, world champion again. 1996, champion for the 3rd time. 1997, champion for the 4th time in a row. 4 world championships, back to back. On an Aprilia painted black and white, with a rider who never smiled on the podium. The Italian press gave him a nickname that felt like a warning. Il Corsaro, the Corsair, the Pirate. By the end of 1997, there was only one question left in motorcycle racing. Could this man do the same thing at the top level? The answer came almost immediately. 1998, Suzuka, his debut race in the 500cc class. Against Mick Doohan, the reigning champion. Against Alex Crivellé. Against every established name in the sport. Max Biaggi won. Not a podium, not a top 5, a win. In his very first premier class race. The first rider in modern history to do that. For a brief moment, MotoGP was certain. The next dominant champion had arrived, and his name was Max Biaggi. The Italian commentator Paolo Beltramo, who watched Biaggi race for over a decade, once described what most people never saw behind the cold face and the tough image. The man Max was hidden too much behind the tough rider that many people did not like. That hidden man was already a legend. The world just did not know it yet. April 8, 2001. Suzuka, Japan. The sky is clear. The track temperature sits at around 28 degrees. This is the opening race of the season, and everyone in the paddock knows it is the last season of the old 2-stroke 500cc era. After this year, everything changes, which means everyone wants to win this year. On the grid, 2 Italians. Max Biaggi on the Yamaha YZR 500, Valentino Rossi on the Honda NSR 500. They already do not like each other. Qualifying. Biaggi takes pole position. Rossi lines up on the front row beside him. The race begins. Within 1 lap, the 2 of them break away from the rest of the field. Alone at the front, 30 seconds ahead of 3rd place, before the race is halfway done. This is not a Grand Prix anymore. This is a duel. Lap 2. The main straight. Rossi tucks into the slipstream behind Biaggi. He pulls out to overtake on the right. Biaggi sees him coming and closes the door. He closes it late. Their shoulders touch at nearly 300 kilometers per hour. Rossi's rear tire skips onto the grass strip beside the track. For a fraction of a second, he is out of control at top speed. He holds the bike. He does not crash. Nobody crashes. But inside the Honda garage, nobody breathes for 6 seconds. Rossi passes Biaggi 7 laps later. He wins the race. Biaggi finishes second, 6 seconds behind. That is the race. But the race is not the story. The story happens that night, in the motorhome area, in a narrow corridor between 2 trucks. No cameras, no official witnesses. Just a rumor about a punch, a torn shirt, and 2 grown men who had to be pulled apart. At the press conference afterwards, Rossi does not hide what he thinks. He tried to push me onto the grass at 300 kilometers per hour. If I crash there, I do not get up. By the time Rossi finishes that sentence, the 6 seconds are over. But something else is just beginning. By Monday morning, Suzuka was already over. But in Milan, in Rome, in every newspaper office in Italy, it was just starting. Gazzetta dello Sport ran the story on the front page. Corriere dello Sport followed the next day. Within 72 hours, 6 seconds of contact had become the biggest sports story in the country. Not a race report, a war report. The Italian television networks smelled the same thing. RAI and Mediaset launched special programs about the duello. Talk shows called in old riders to pick sides. Newspapers published side-by-side photos, always with Rossi on the left and Biaggi on the right. Never the other way around. Within 1 month, every race on the calendar was being framed by the same single question. Did Rossi beat Biaggi again? Nobody asked either man about corner entry anymore. Nobody asked about bike setup. Nobody asked about tire choice. They only asked about each other. And when the 2 of them were asked about each other, they answered with anger. The angrier the answers, the more papers sold. The more papers sold, the sharper the questions became. Rossi was young, funny, blonde. Biaggi was cold, private, and already carrying that pirate nickname. The media did not need to pick a side. The public had picked one by the second issue. While both riders were trying to focus on winning races, a story was being written about them, but not by them. By 2004, reporters had stopped asking either man about motorcycles at all. They only asked about the look, the missing handshake, who greeted who first at the paddock gate. Years later, long after the racing was over, Biaggi finally said the sentence that explained everything. We were 2 fools to fight through the media instead of sitting down and talking face to face. But by the time he understood that, the story had already been written. And Max Biaggi was no longer the one holding the pen. Here is the part of the story almost nobody tells. While the newspapers were writing about the war, Max Biaggi kept winning races. 13 times in the Premier class, 42 podium finishes. 6 times he ended a season as the runner-up in the World Championship. He raced for Kanemoto Honda. He raced for Marlboro Yamaha. He beat Rossi in specific races, on specific afternoons. But something strange was happening to those wins. They were still counted. They were still recorded. But when people talked about them on Monday morning, the sentence had changed. It was no longer, Biaggi won at Brno. It was, Rossi lost at Brno. Same result. 2 completely different stories. By the time MotoGP documentaries were being produced, Biaggi was no longer the man who had won 13 races. He had become the man Rossi had to beat, a supporting character in someone else's biography. And here is what makes it truly sad. Biaggi himself was the last person on earth who would fight for his own memory. He never celebrated. He never soaked in a single win. He said it himself, years later, in one of the quietly heartbreaking sentences a champion has ever spoken about his own career. I never really enjoyed my victories. I was already thinking about the next race, the next championship. If the man who won the races could not stop long enough to remember them, how could anyone else? By 2005, MotoGP was done with him. 34 years old. No seat, no factory team. Most people thought his story was over. It was not. 2007. Max Biaggi signs a contract with Suzuki Alstare Corona in the World Superbike Championship. For many fans, this was the ending. A former Grand Prix star dropping down to what the paddock quietly called the second tier. The kind of move that usually means a rider is winding down toward retirement. But Biaggi did not come to Superbike to retire. 2010. He switches to Aprilia, the same Italian brand that had given him his 4250cc world titles 15 years earlier. The bike is the Aprilia RSV4, fast, brutal, and untested at the top level. That season, Max Biaggi wins the World Superbike Championship, his 5th world title. Nobody in MotoGP is talking about it. 2 years later, at the age of 41, he does it again. 2012. World Superbike champion for the second time. At that moment, he becomes the oldest World Superbike champion in the history of the series. 6 world titles in total. On 2 completely different types of motorcycle. In 2 different eras. But go back and watch the MotoGP retrospectives from that decade. Watch the tribute videos. Watch the history specials. 2 extra world titles, and they barely appear at all. Because by then, Biaggi had already been moved to the supporting cast, and the supporting cast does not get their own chapter. After that second title, Biaggi said something that told you everything about the man he had become. For me, this is more than a championship. This is a proof, not for others, for myself. He had stopped racing for the story. He was racing for the record. So when we finally add it all up, what exactly did MotoGP erase? Let us do something simple now. Let us just read the file. 4 world championships in the 250cc class. Back to back. A winning debut in the 500cc class. First rider in modern history to do it. 13 victories in the Premier class. 42 podium finishes. 6 times a World Championship runner-up. 2 World Superbike titles. Inducted as a MotoGP legend in 2016. One of the most successful Italian riders in the entire history of motorsport. Now here is the question that should be impossible to answer. If all of that belongs to a legend, why has his story become little more than a chapter inside someone else's? Years after the racing was over, Rossi himself finally admitted something the media had spent 2 decades pretending was not true. The rivalry with Biaggi was also my fault. And Biaggi, when Rossi announced his retirement in 2021, said something even more revealing, something that a man who was truly erased would never be able to say. The day Valentino retires, a part of my own life closes with him. Think about that for a moment. 2 men who once could not stand each other, 2 men whose faces filled Italian newspapers for years as symbols of opposite sides. And in the end, they had become part of the same story. Just not the story either of them thought they were writing. MotoGP did not erase Max Biaggi with one decision. It erased him a little at a time. One headline, one rivalry, one documentary, one memory, until one of the greatest riders of his generation slowly stopped being the hero of his own story. He is still there, in the record books, in the archives, in the corner of every photograph ever taken of Valentino Rossi, waiting for someone to look. Records survive, stories change. Which one do you remember him by?